Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The rain outside Jack Reynolds' modest post-presidential home beat against the window like a relentless drum. The once bustling house had become eerily quiet since his election defeat. No more aides, no more reporters, just the silence that echoed through the halls, punctuated by the occasional chirp of his phone or the click of his computer mouse. Defeat had been bitter, and while Jack understood the public's desire for change, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deeply wrong about the entire election. The results had felt off, and yet there was no proof. Tonight was one of those quiet nights, the kind that stretched on endlessly, offering no respite from his thought. Jack sat at his desk, staring at the glow of his computer screen, pretending to focus on mundane tasks. Old campaign reports, speeches he never got to deliver. It was all he had to hold on to from his time in power. The world outside moved on without him, leaving him behind to wallow in his thought. Then, without warning, the screen flickered, the room, soft lighting dimmed as a strange buzzing filled the air. Jack leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the computer as static overtook the screen. For a moment, he thought the power might have gone out, but everything else in the room remained stable. A message appeared. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers, faint but unmistakably there. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he adjusted his chair, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "Mr. President," the voice rasped, "you have little time." Jack blinked in confusion. The words were garbled, broken by interference, but the message was clear enough. He hadn't been called Mr. President by anyone outside of formalities since the loss was the Supreme. "There is war extinction," the voice stuttered, sounding as though it was being transmitted from a great distance. Jack leaned in closer, his breath catching. This wasn't some random hack or phone call. It was too deliberate, too specific. "What the hell is this?" Jack muttered, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the door with a camera, shouting, "They gotcha." Dairy, but no one came. The rain outside beat steadily on, the house as quiet as ever. "Must stop at Antarctica, war humans." The voice crackled again, and then it was gone. The screen flickered, returning to the idle home screen Jack had been staring at just minutes ago. He sat there, frozen, his mind racing. "Antarctica, war humans." The words rang in his ears. This couldn't be real. His rational mind told him it was some elaborate hoax, but deep down, something else stirred. A sense of dread and urgency, like the world had tilted off its axis, and he was the only one who could feel it. He ran a hand through his silvering hair, then typed quickly into the search bar, looking for any recent events in Antarctica. It was a shot in the dark, but if the message was even remotely credible, there had to be something. After a few minutes of scrolling through news reports, Jack's eyes landed on an article buried deep in the search result. "Unexplained seismic activity in Antarctica raises concerns," the headline read. His brow furrowed as he clicked on it. The article was short, barely more than a paragraph, but it detailed a series of recent tremors in a remote part of the continent, far from any known fault line. Scientists were baffled, speculating everything from geothermal shifts to underground volcanic activity, but no one had an answer. Jack sat back, staring at the screen. His instincts screamed that this was more than a coincidence. He had spent decades in politics, and he knew when something was being deliberately hidden. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain of what to do next. The warning had been brief, but it had been clear. A war capable of ending humanity was coming, and it was somehow linked to Antarctica. He couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this than just natural phenomena. His election loss had never sat right with him, and now, as absurd as it seemed, he wondered if it had all been orchestrated to keep him out of the way during a critical moment. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jack looked up as his assistant, Tim, poked his head into the room. "Everything okay, Mr. Reynolds?" Tim asked, his voice filled with the cautious respect of someone who wasn't sure if their presence was welcome. Jack cleared his throat, trying to shake off the strange sense of foreboding that had settled over him.
"Yeah.
Just going over some old note." Tim nodded, glancing at the screen, but clearly not seeing anything out of the ordinary. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be in the other room. I'll lock up on my way out." Jack waved him off and watched as Tim disappeared into the hallway, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. He stared at the computer, then at the small slip of paper on his desk where he scribbled the words Antarctica and war in his barely legible handwriting. He wasn't sure what to do with this information yet, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. His fingers tapped the desk nervously as he considered his option. He had no official power anymore, no influence over the military or intelligence agency, but he still had contacts, people who owed him favors, people who would listen. And if what the voice had said was true, then the stakes were too high to remain idle. Without another word, Jack stood and grabbed his coat, determination settling over him like a cloak. He wasn't going to let this go, not until he knew the truth. The drive to the old government facility in the outskirts of Senate was a quiet one, the rain never letting up as Jack sped through the nearly deserted street. He had made some calls, quiet, subtle inquiries to old colleagues in the intelligence community. The signal, whatever it was, needed to be verified, and he needed answered. But none of the official channels were willing to give him anything. Most thought he was grasping at straws, a former president desperate to remain relevant. But there had been one lead, a former defense contractor who had worked on classified operations during Jack's presidency. His name was Dr. Emily Carter, a scientist who had been involved in some of the government, a more secretive research program. Jack hadn't spoken to her in years, but her name had come up in connection with an obscure project that involved predictive algorithms and time manipulation. It sounded like something out of science fiction, but after the message he had received, nothing seemed impossible anymore. As Jack pulled into the facility C parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The place was practically abandoned, its windows dark and its gates locked, but his contact had assured him that Carter was still there, working on something. He stepped out of the car, pulling his coat tight against the rain as he approached the entrance. The security pad was still operational, though it took a few tries before it accepted the access code he'd been given. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Jack stepped inside. The facility was cold, sterile, and eerily quiet. He made his way through the dimly lit halls, his footsteps echoing off the tile floor. There were no signs of life, no guards, no staff, just the hum of machinery in the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the research wing. A single light flickered at the end of the hall, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. Jack hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. At the far end of the lab, standing over a desk cluttered with papers and monitors, was a woman in her early 40s, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She didn't look up as he entered, but Jack knew it was her Emily Carter. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her voice calm but laced with tension. She finally turned to face him, her eyes scanning him up and down, as if she were assessing whether he was still the man she remembered. "I didn't expect a welcome committee," Jack replied, trying to keep his tone light. But there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I got a message, a signal from the future." Emily raised an eyebrow, then sighed, turning back to her monitors. "You are not the only one." Jack stared at Emily, unsure if he heard her correctly. "Carrick, what do you mean I am not the only one?" Emily sighed and pushed a few papers aside, revealing a sleek, high-tech device that hummed faintly on the desk. "You received a signal? So did I. And so did several others. Scientists, intelligence officers, people with influence. We've all been getting these messages, but they were not all the same. Some of us got warnings of war, others, they've been shown something even worse." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, worse than a war that could wipe out humanity. Emily gave a short, humorless laugh. "Paris, yes, worse. The war is just the beginning. If we can, stop it. Something much darker is coming after it." "The signals are from the future, Jack. They were not a joke. They were fragments from a timeline we were racing to prevent, sent back to give us a chance to change things." Jack rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Free, cry wine. Now, why did this start after the election?" "Because the timeline changed when you lost," Emily said bluntly. "In the original timeline, you were supposed to win. Your policies, your approach, they would have delayed the conflict, maybe even stopped it. But when you lost, the chain of events shifted now. Whoever side in the war is moving faster, and we were running out of time." Jack paced the small space of the lab, his mind racing. "And you reassure it's coming from the future. This isn't experimental tech being used against us." Emily leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. "Sure. The tech we developed was meant to anticipate future outcomes, but it's only evolved far beyond that. Somewhere along the line, the predictive algorithm started to receive data from the future. But not just any future, our future. The war you heard about it's inevitable, unless we stop it now. How, Jack asked, his voice tight. How do we stop a war that hasn't happened yet? Emily paused, studying him for a moment before speaking. Sorry, there's a location, a research facility hidden in Antarctica. It's center where the final pieces of this puzzle are being kept. The technology that could either prevent or accelerate this war is there. But it's guarded and you can just walk in and ask for it. Who's guarding it? Jack asked. He already had an idea. If the conspiracy ran as deep as Emily was suggesting, there were likely layers of protection around whatever lay in that facility. Private contractors, some loyal to the new administration, some to corporations that stand to gain from the conflict. They didn't know exactly what they were protecting, but they know it's important. If we want to stop the war, we need to get inside that facility and take control of the tech before it falls into the wrong hands. Jack clenched his fists. Why didn't you two tell anyone about this earlier? Why keep it a secret? Emily narrowed her eyes. Who exactly was I supposed to tell? The same people who stand to profit from chaos. The same people who orchestrated your loss because they knew you wouldn't play along with their plans. This isn't about national security anymore. Jack had said about survival humanity. Survival. Jack stopped pacing, the weight of her words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He had spent his entire life fighting for what he believed was right, serving his country, protecting its interests. But now the battlefield was different. He wasn't fighting for a nation. He was fighting for the future itself. He met Emily's sim gaze. What do we do next? Emily stood, grabbing a black case from under the desk and placing it in front of him. She opened it, revealing a series of encrypted files and several small, sleek devices. We go to Antarctica, she said simply, pathly. But we won, TB alone. The people who sent us the signals, the ones still out there, they'll help us. We need to assemble a team, Jack, and we need to move fast. Jack looked down at the case, then back at Emily Howler, and if we fail, she'll... Her expression darkened. If we fail, the war happens, and everything after it. Well, we won. They'll be around to see it. They both stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling between them like a storm waiting to break. Jack knew what was at stake now, and for the first time since losing the election, he felt a sense of purpose again. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been, but he wasn't the type to back down from a fight. The flight to Antarctica was long and silent, the hum of the jet engines the only sound as Jack and Emily reviewed their plan. The team had come together faster than Jack had expected. Former military personnel, intelligence agents, even a few rogue scientists who had worked on classified projects. They all had one thing in common. They had received the same signals, and they were all determined to stop the future war. As the jet descended over the icy continent, Jack stared out the window at the vast frozen landscape below. The facility they were targeting was hidden beneath the ice, its existence known only to a select few. Getting in wouldn't be easy, but they had a plan. The team landed at a remote airstrip far from any known research station. From there, they would travel by snow vehicles, navigating the treacherous terrain until they reached the facility. Time was running out. According to the latest signal, the war would begin within months if they didn't intervene. The cold bit into Jack's skin as he stepped out of the jet, the wind howling around him. Emily was already coordinating with the rest of the team, their movements precise and rehearsed. They had trained for this, every detail planned out. Now it was a matter of execution. Hours passed as they made their way across the frozen wasteland, the facility looming in the distance like a fortress of steel and ice. Jack's breath fogged in the freezing air as he adjusted his goggles, keeping his eyes trained on the structure ahead. They were close now, closer than they had ever been. But as they approached, something felt off. The facility cell's defenses were supposed to be state-of-the-art, impenetrable. Yet there were no signs of activity, no guards, no patrols. The place was eerily silent. Emily's voice crackled over the comms. Something is wrong. There should be more security here. Jack nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. Nah, stay alert. This could be a trap. They moved in cautiously, their steps silent as they approached the facility. Its entrance. The door was sealed, but Emily quickly hacked the control panel and it slid open with a hiss. Inside, the facility was just as cold and sterile as Jack had imagined, metal walls, harsh lighting, and the constant hum of machinery. The team split up, moving through the corridors with military precision. Jack and Emily headed straight for the control room where the data they needed was stored. If they could get their hands on it, they could stop the war before it even began. But as they reached the control room, they found it already occupied. A man stood in the center of the room, his back to them, as he studied the monitor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the same high-tech gear as the guards they had expected to encounter. Jack raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. Jack barked. The man turned slowly, his face partially obscured by a visor, but Jack recognized him immediately. "General Harris," Jack said, lowering his weapon in shock. "Arrow, what the hell are you doing here?" Harris had been one of Jack's most trusted military advisors during his presidency, a man who had always advocated for strength and preparedness. But now seeing him here in the heart of the facility they were trying to infiltrate, Jack felt a wave of betrayal wash over him. "I could ask you the same thing, Mr. President," here Harris replied, his voice cold and measured. "First, you were never supposed to find this place." Jack took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" "Harris, why are you involved in this?" Harris sighed, removing his visor and revealing a face lined with years of experience and hardened by countless battles. "I've been part of this project since the beginning. The signals, the technology. It was all part of a plan to protect humanity. But you were never meant to know." Emily stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Protect humanity? By starting a war that will wipe us all out." Harris shook his head. "You don't understand. The war is necessary. It's now the only way to ensure our survival. The world is on the brink of collapse, overpopulation, dwindling resources. This war will reset the balance, and when it's sent over, humanity will emerge stronger." Jack felt his blood run cold. "You were talking about sacrificing billions of lives." Harris met his gaze unflinching. "Hike for the greater good." "How?" Jack Shea's hand tightened around his weapon. "I can't let that happen." Harris smiled faintly, his eyes hard. "You want to have a choice. It's already begun." Before Jack could react, alarms blared throughout the facility. The screens around them lit up with warning messages, and a countdown timer appeared at the center of the main monitor. The war had already started. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Emily. "Fire, we need to stop this now." Emily was already at the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she tried to override the system. But it was too late. The facility had been set to trigger the war, and there was nothing they could do to stop it from here. Harris watched them with a calm, detached expression. "Harry, you can stop the future, Jack, it's already written." But Jack wasn't willing to accept that, not yet.